Hidden beneath sticks and brush in the Georgia woods, investigators discovered the body of a beautiful young woman. She had been strangled with someone's bare hands, discarded like she meant nothing. But Anitra Gunn meant everything to the people who loved her. 4 days earlier, on Valentine's Day, the 23-year-old college senior had simply vanished. The last person to see her alive? Her boyfriend, a soldier who claimed to love her. What authorities uncovered next would reveal a chilling pattern of control, jealousy, and violence that had been building for months. This is the story of how a day meant for celebrating love became the beginning of a father's worst nightmare. Welcome to Cold Crime Cases, where we dive deep into the most haunting true crime stories that continue to grip our nation. I'm your host, and today we're examining a case that shook Fort Valley, Georgia to its core. Before we begin, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Whether you're listening from Atlanta, across the country, or anywhere in the world, let me know you're here. Now, let's get into this devastating case. February 14th, 2020. While most people were buying flowers and chocolate, celebrating love and romance, Anitra Gunn's family was about to enter a living hell. The vivacious college senior had gone silent. No calls, no texts, no social media activity. For a young woman who was constantly connected to her father and friends, the silence was deafening and terrifying. Anitra Gunn came into this world on November 6th, in Camp Hill, Alabama. She was the daughter of Christopher Gunn and Melissa Shearhouse, blessed with one brother and one sister who adored her. Her childhood was filled with laughter, music, and dreams bigger than the small town where she was born. But in 2014, when Anitra was just a teenager, tragedy ripped through her life like a tornado. Her mother was killed in a devastating car accident, leaving a void that could never truly be filled. For most teenagers, losing a parent would be crushing, potentially life-destroying. But Anitra? She carried that grief with a strength and grace that left everyone who knew her in absolute awe. Her father, Christopher, would later say that after her mother's death, Anitra became the center of his universe, his pride, his reason to keep going. They had survived the unimaginable together, their bond forged in shared grief and unwavering love. Growing up primarily in Atlanta, Anitra attended Westlake High School, where classmates remember her as the girl with the infectious smile, the one who could light up any room she walked into. She was reliable, caring, and genuinely interested in other people's lives. After graduating in 2016, she set her sights on Fort Valley State University, a historically black college nestled in Fort Valley, Georgia. At Fort Valley State, Anitra didn't just attend, she thrived. She majored in visual and performing arts, pouring her soul into her studies and creative projects. Her passion for music led her to join both the school's concert choir and gospel choir, where her voice was described by fellow students as nothing short of soulful, the kind of voice that gave you chills and made you believe in something greater. Beyond campus, she worked at a local restaurant, juggling her job with her studies while still making time for friends and family. One friend told reporters something that perfectly captured who Anitra was. She was always there for everyone else, always putting others first, always showing up, always caring. Her father spoke of a young woman who had overcome tremendous loss and was finally stepping into her future with confidence and hope. By early 2020, Anitra was just months away from graduation. She could see the finish line. New opportunities were on the horizon. New possibilities were opening up. She was 23 years old, standing on the threshold of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. She was ready to spread her wings and fly. But there was something dark lurking beneath the surface of her seemingly bright future. A relationship that had started to consume her. A connection that had become toxic, dangerous, and ultimately deadly. In the months before she disappeared, Anitra found herself entangled in a complicated, on-again, off-again relationship with 23-year-old Demarcus Little. They had met through mutual friends, and by the fall of 2019, they were spending significant time together. On paper, Demarcus seemed like a catch. He was a soldier in the U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Gordon in Augusta. To his family, he was a disciplined young man raised in the church, someone they described as respectful and dependable, a man in uniform with his whole life ahead of him. But for those closest to Anitra, a completely different picture was emerging, a darker reality that would prove impossible to ignore. Their relationship had quickly spiraled from romantic to complicated to downright troubling. Court records and text messages later revealed that by September 2019, just months after they started dating, serious arguments were already surfacing with alarming frequency. Anitra confided in her friends that she felt manipulated, that the relationship was draining her rather than supporting her. In one particularly revealing message she sent in November 2019, she told Demarcus plainly that they should stop speaking because every single time they talked, she felt manipulated. Think about that for a moment. This young woman, who had already lost her mother and knew what real love looked like, was recognizing the manipulation and trying to break free. Every time someone scrolls past, another woman's suffering fades into silence. Don't let that happen. Subscribe and make her story matter. But Demarcus wasn't going to let go easily. In other messages that investigators would later uncover, he accused her of playing games, of seeing other men behind his back, of not being committed enough. And then came the threats that should have sent up every red flag imaginable. He threatened to harm himself if she ended things. This is textbook manipulation, emotional blackmail designed to keep someone trapped in a toxic relationship through fear and guilt. By early 2020, just weeks before Valentine's Day, their relationship had deteriorated to the breaking point. The tension was suffocating. The arguments were escalating. And then, in early February, something happened that should have been a wake-up call to everyone. Police were called after Anitra's tires were slashed and the windows of her apartment were smashed. Shattered glass everywhere, a clear message of rage and control. Prosecutors would later present evidence showing that Demarcus was responsible for this destruction. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was personal. This was violent. This was a warning of what was to come. But to outsiders who didn't know what was happening behind closed doors, Demarcus was still the promising young soldier with his life together. Only Anitra and those closest to her could see the red flags multiplying, getting bigger, getting more dangerous. In the days leading up to her disappearance, those red flags became impossible to ignore. On campus, Anitra tried to maintain her smile, tried to stay focused on her classes and her music. But those who knew her best could see the weight she was carrying on her shoulders. Even as she sang in the choir or spent time with friends, there were moments when she seemed distant, distracted, worried. They later said she was trying desperately to move forward, to focus on her future and graduation, but the relationship was clearly wearing her down, eating away at her peace. Despite all the warning signs, despite all the red flags waving frantically in the wind, no one could have predicted what was coming. No one could have imagined that Valentine's Day 2020 would be the day that changed everything forever. For most people, February 14th was just another Friday filled with romantic gestures, flowers, dinner reservations, and declarations of love. But for Anitra's family, it would become the day their entire world collapsed. The day the silence became unbearable. The day their worst fears began creeping toward reality. The night before, February 13th, the exact details of Anitra's day remain somewhat unclear. But what we do know is that evening, she attended a party, and Demarcus was there too with a group of his friends. Although she had arrived at the party with someone else, she ended up leaving with Demarcus and his friend, who later told police he dropped them both off at Anitra's apartment. It was a decision that would haunt everyone who loved her. In the early morning hours of Valentine's Day, Anitra and Demarcus went to grab something to eat at a local Waffle House, arriving at the restaurant around 2 a.m. Security footage would later confirm they were there. They stayed for approximately 30 minutes, and then they headed to the home of Demarcus's aunt. This was the last place Anitra would be seen alive. The next morning, when Christopher Gunn tried to reach his daughter, there was nothing. The phone calls went straight to voicemail. The text messages sat unread, the little check marks never turning blue. At first, it might have seemed like Anitra was just busy with school, or sleeping in, or caught up with friends. But as the morning turned to afternoon, and afternoon turned to evening, that silence began to feel heavier, more ominous, more wrong. By the next day, February 15th, the worry had transformed into full-blown panic. Friends hadn't seen her. She hadn't shown up for her shift at work, which was completely unlike her. When Christopher drove down from Atlanta to Fort Valley to check on his daughter, his worst fears began materializing. An official missing persons report was filed, and the panic among those who knew and loved Anitra grew exponentially. But the same day, the mystery surrounding her disappearance took an even more disturbing turn. Hours after she was officially reported missing, her car was discovered with fresh damage on Bell Avenue, not far from her apartment. The front bumper was completely missing, and the vehicle was scraped and dented, sitting in a neighbor's yard like it had been abandoned in a hurry. This was a chilling detail that immediately raised serious concerns, because just days earlier, on February 5th, her tires had been slashed in what prosecutors believed was an act of violence by Demarcus. To those who loved Anitra, it felt like the danger had been closing in, tightening around her like a noose. Calls to her phone continued going straight to voicemail. Her social media went dark. And for Christopher, the dread grew stronger with every passing hour. He knew his daughter. He knew her habits, her reliability, her constant communication. And he knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had happened. Before long, Anitra wasn't just a young woman who had missed some calls. She was officially a missing person, and law enforcement was mobilizing. Officers in Fort Valley began canvassing the area immediately, retracing Anitra's steps from the party to the Waffle House to the aunt's home. They interviewed Demarcus, the last known person to have seen her alive, who claimed to have no knowledge of where Anitra could possibly be. His aunt was also questioned, and she claimed to have seen Anitra that morning at her home. But what happened after that remained a complete mystery, a terrifying blank space that needed to be filled. This took me hours of painful research, reading autopsies, police files, and the cries of women that were ignored. If you felt safe watching from your screen, the least you can do is hit that red subscribe button. They questioned friends, neighbors, classmates, anyone who might have information. Within hours, what started as a welfare check had shifted into a full-scale search operation. The community rallied with incredible speed and dedication. Volunteers began combing through the area looking for any signs of her. Flyers with Anitra's beautiful, smiling face went up on every street corner, in every storefront window. Vigils were planned as the community came together in prayer. Her classmates at Fort Valley State held their own searches while organizing prayer circles, hoping and praying for her safe return. But as the hours stretched into days, hope became harder and harder to hold on to. The silence was deafening. The lack of any trace of Anitra was terrifying. And deep down, many people were beginning to fear the worst. On Monday, February 17th, the search efforts grew into something much larger and more organized. A special multi-agency task force was created, bringing together the Fort Valley Department of Public Safety, the Peach County Sheriff's Office, Fort Valley State University Police, the Bibb County District Attorney's Office, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Perry Office. Even the Georgia State Patrol joined the effort, sending aviation support to scour the woods and fields of the surrounding area from the air. Helicopters flying low over the tree canopy, searching for any sign of the missing young woman. That same day, Fort Valley State University released an official statement about Anitra's disappearance, urging anyone with any information, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, to come forward immediately. The campus community was absolutely shaken. This wasn't just another student missing a few classes. This was one of their own. A young woman known throughout the campus for her radiant smile, her incredible talent, and her unwavering determination. The hallways felt emptier. The choir rehearsals felt incomplete. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for news. Christopher also released a heartbreaking statement that day, publicly voicing what he had known in his heart from the very beginning. It was out of character for his daughter not to be in contact. This wasn't Anitra. This wasn't how she operated. She wouldn't just disappear without telling anyone. He pleaded for her safe return. For anyone who knew anything to please come forward. For a father who had already lost his wife, the thought of losing his daughter was absolutely unimaginable. A nightmare beyond comprehension. The task force worked around the clock, searching relentlessly, questioning potential witnesses, following every possible lead, no matter how small. As the sun set on that Monday evening, the community braced themselves for what the next day might bring, knowing that with each passing hour, the chances of finding Anitra alive were diminishing. By Monday night, the search for Anitra had taken on a new level of urgency. Police, the GBI, even Georgia State Patrol aircraft were covering every possible angle, every potential location. Everyone was on edge, checking their phones constantly, waiting for news that never seemed to come. Friends who were used to seeing her every day, hearing her laughter in the hallways, listening to her sing, were now checking their phones obsessively, waiting for any update. Christopher's words that it was completely out of character for his daughter not to be in touch weighed heavily on everyone involved. He had always been so close to his daughter, especially after losing his wife years earlier. That bond had been unbreakable. He knew in his soul that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The hours stretched on, each one filled with more questions than answers. And as Tuesday morning approached, the sense of dread grew exponentially stronger. Everyone hoped and prayed that Anitra would be found safe, that there would be some reasonable explanation for her disappearance. But in their hearts, many were already beginning to fear the truth that nobody wanted to face. On February 18, 2020, investigators finally found what they had been desperately searching for. But it wasn't the miracle everyone had been praying for. By this point, the search for Anitra had stretched across multiple counties in Georgia. Authorities were combing through wooded areas in both Peach and Crawford counties, and they had even extended their efforts into nearby Taylor County after an anonymous tipster reported seeing Demarcus Little on a piece of property there in the days immediately following Anitra's disappearance. The Georgia State Patrol had troopers on the ground assisting with the search. Crime Stoppers had announced a reward for any information that might finally bring some answers and closure to this nightmare. But that Tuesday afternoon, around 3:20 p.m., a Peach County deputy searching near the Peach-Crawford County line came across something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath brush and debris, covered with sticks like someone had tried desperately to conceal what they had done, was the body of a young woman. Her physical description matched Anitra's perfectly. She had been discarded in those woods like her life didn't matter, like she was nothing. But she mattered to so many people. She mattered to her father, her siblings, her friends, her classmates, her professors, everyone whose life she had touched with her kindness and her light. And in that devastating moment, all hope of bringing her home alive was completely shattered. Word of the discovery spread through Fort Valley like wildfire, and Christopher was forced to face the absolutely unimaginable reality that every parent dreads. His daughter, his baby girl, his reason for living after losing his wife, was gone. The impact was immediate and crushing. At Fort Valley State, students gathered together on campus, holding each other as they cried, completely unable to comprehend how someone so full of life, someone with so much promise, could be gone. Professors and staff members who had watched Anitra grow and flourish over her 4 years at the university struggled to find any words that could comfort their devastated students. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed, I'm honestly curious what's holding you back. Drop it in the comments. I actually want to know. For many people on that campus, it felt like losing a family member. The choir felt incomplete. The hallways felt darker. The entire university was grieving. With Anitra no longer missing, Christopher was now faced with the unbearable, unthinkable task of planning his daughter's funeral. He had begged for her safe return, held on to hope longer than most would have dared to, and now he was left with only memories and an ocean of grief. His pain was echoed by an entire community that had embraced Anitra as one of their own. Fort Valley State, the local community, everyone who had joined the search, they were all mourning. But alongside the overwhelming grief came a demand for answers and justice. Someone had taken Anitra's life. Someone had stolen her future, her dreams, everything she had worked so hard to achieve. And now investigators were absolutely determined to prove who was responsible and ensure they faced the full consequences of their actions. Following the discovery of her body, Anitra was immediately transported to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for a complete autopsy. At first, investigators remained cautious, waiting for the official results that would explain exactly how her life had ended and when. But soon, the findings confirmed what many had already suspected in their hearts. Anitra's death was officially ruled a homicide. The medical examiner determined that she had been killed by manual strangulation, meaning someone had wrapped their hands around her throat and squeezed the life out of her while she fought to breathe. It was a brutal, deeply personal, intimate act of violence, one that left absolutely no doubt that someone had intentionally and deliberately ended her life. That single detail shifted the entire trajectory of the case. This was no longer about just a missing woman or a tragic accident. This was murder, plain and simple. For Anitra's family, the official confirmation was devastating beyond words. Hearing the word homicide attached to her name brought the nightmare into sharp, unbearable focus. For investigators, however, it meant they could now narrow their focus onto a suspect, and their eyes were already locked onto the man who had been closest to Anitra in those final, fatal hours. Demarcus Little. Even before Anitra disappeared into thin air, there had been deeply troubling signs in her relationship with Demarcus. Remember, on February 5th, just 9 days before she was last seen alive, police were called after someone viciously slashed her tires and smashed the windows of her apartment in what appeared to be an explosion of rage. Investigators quickly tied that act of destruction directly to Demarcus. It was an early, glaring indication that their relationship had turned volatile and dangerous, and it gave police a crystal-clear reason to keep their attention focused squarely on him. After Anitra's body was discovered and the autopsy confirmed that she had been strangled to death, that earlier act of vandalism took on a much deeper, more sinister meaning. To investigators, this wasn't just an angry boyfriend having a bad day and doing something stupid. This was part of a dangerous, escalating pattern of violence and control. They were looking at a young woman who had been desperately trying to step away from a toxic, abusive relationship, and a boyfriend whose behavior was growing more alarming, more possessive, and ultimately deadly. Detectives began meticulously retracing Anitra's final hours on Earth. She was last seen on Valentine's Day with Demarcus at his aunt's home. After that moment, her phone went completely silent. No calls, no texts, no activity whatsoever. Friends told police that Anitra had confided in them about feeling controlled, manipulated, and trapped. The text messages that investigators recovered from her phone confirmed everything her friends had said. The exchanges were filled with jealousy, baseless accusations, manipulation tactics, and even threats of self-harm if she tried to leave. On the evening of February 18th, just hours after Anitra's body was found hidden in those woods. Fort Valley police brought Demarcus in for questioning once again. By 6:30 p.m. that night, he was arrested and booked into the Peach County Jail. Officially, at that moment, he was being charged for the February 5th attack on Anitra's car and apartment. But investigators were already absolutely convinced that Demarcus was responsible for something far, far more serious: the murder of Anitra Gunn. They just needed to build an airtight case to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. After Demarcus was taken into custody on February 18th, investigators continued working tirelessly behind the scenes, building their case piece by piece. The autopsy results had definitively confirmed that Anitra had been murdered, and with her death officially ruled a homicide, the entire focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. Detectives pulled all the records from Anitra's cell phone and discovered that her last known location pinged near Demarcus's aunt's house on Valentine's Day. And then, after that final ping, the trail went completely dark and cold. The cell phone data, combined with the property damage incident just days before she disappeared, painted a picture that investigators simply could not ignore. By the end of February, prosecutors felt they had gathered enough evidence to move forward. A murder warrant was officially issued, and Demarcus, who was already sitting in jail on the earlier vandalism charges, now faced the much heavier, life-altering accusation of murdering Anitra. Investigators had also looked carefully into his movements in the days after Anitra vanished. An anonymous tip had placed him on a property in Taylor County during that crucial time window, a detail that only deepened their suspicion that he was responsible. Search teams descended on that area, meticulously combing through it, searching for anything that might connect him to the location where her body was eventually discovered. If stories like this make you want to protect the innocent and expose the truth, then don't just watch. Subscribe. That single click could be the reason another story finally gets heard. Piece by piece, like putting together a devastating puzzle, the picture came into sharp focus. The timeline of events, the digital evidence, the pattern of escalating violence and control, all of it pointed directly back to Demarcus Little. On February 25, 2020, just 1 week after Anitra's body was found discarded in those woods, a Peach County grand jury returned an indictment against Demarcus Little. He was formally charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and concealing a death. The indictment laid out the state's case in stark, unambiguous terms. On Valentine's Day 2020, Demarcus strangled Anitra Gunn to death, and then attempted to hide her body in the woods of Crawford County, covering her with brush as if she meant nothing. For investigators, the indictment represented a major turning point in the case. They had moved from suspicion to formal accusation, from gathering evidence in the field to preparing for a courtroom battle. But for Anitra's family, the indictment brought both a sense of relief and a fresh, agonizing wound. It meant the state was moving forward, that someone would be held accountable for taking their beloved daughter's life. But it also forced them to confront the horrific truth they had feared all along: that Anitra's life had not only been taken intentionally, but that the person accused of this heinous act was the man she had once trusted, maybe even loved. The weight of that betrayal was something that no father, no family, should ever have to carry. What had begun as whispers and suspicions was now written in official legal documents in black and white. People who had been following every update, hanging on every piece of news, now spoke less about hope and more about justice. There was still overwhelming sadness, yes, but there was also a steely determination to see this case through to the very end. The mood in Fort Valley shifted dramatically from desperately searching for answers to patiently waiting for accountability. And for everyone who had loved Anitra, who had mourned her loss, who had attended her vigils and searched for her in those woods, the indictment was a sobering reminder that a trial was coming. With it would come painful details, heartbreaking testimony, and the reliving of a nightmare. But there was also a sense that the first important steps toward justice had finally been taken, and that Anitra's voice, so cruelly stolen from her, would now be heard loud and clear in a courtroom. In March of 2022, more than 2 agonizing years after Anitra's death, the case against Demarcus Little finally went to trial in Peach County Superior Court. The courtroom was absolutely packed to capacity. Anitra's family members, her friends from Fort Valley State, reporters from across the state, and concerned community members all filled every available seat, waiting to hear how the state would lay out its devastating case. For Christopher Gunn, walking into that courtroom meant sitting just feet away from the man accused of murdering his precious daughter, the man who had supposedly loved her, the man who had taken everything from him. Prosecutors opened the trial with a simple but absolutely devastating theory. On Valentine's Day, 2020, after months of escalating conflict, jealousy, and violence, Demarcus Little strangled Anitra Gunn to death during an argument. They methodically pointed to the timeline of events, showing how she was last seen alive at his aunt's home, which they firmly believed was the location where the murder actually took place. They showed how her phone went completely silent after that, and how Demarcus became the last known person to see her breathing. The jury heard detailed testimony about the February 5th incident when Anitra's tires were slashed and her apartment windows were violently smashed. They heard about the disturbing text messages that revealed a relationship poisoned by jealousy, manipulation, and control. They saw the official autopsy findings and heard expert testimony about manual strangulation, an act prosecutors emphasized was deliberate, intimate, and required sustained pressure. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of passion. This was murder. From the very beginning, the prosecution painted a clear, compelling picture. A young woman desperately trying to move forward with her life and build her future, and a boyfriend who absolutely refused to let her go, who would rather see her dead than see her free. When the defense finally had their turn, Demarcus Little took the stand in his own defense. He admitted to damaging Anitra's car and apartment in early February, but he adamantly denied killing her. He told the jury that he had loved Anitra deeply, calling her his soulmate, and insisted that he would never, ever hurt her. His defense attorneys pointed to his military service and his previously clean criminal record, arguing that the state simply hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for her death. But as the trial unfolded day after day, the case against Demarcus only grew heavier and more damning. The day after Demarcus was initially indicted, one of his friends, Javon Abram, was arrested and charged with concealing a death and making false statements to investigators. Prosecutors alleged that this showed Demarcus hadn't acted completely alone in the aftermath of the murder, that someone had actively helped him try to hide what he had done to Anitra. At trial, Abram took the witness stand and delivered absolutely shocking testimony against his former friend. He told the jury that Demarcus had confessed the murder to him, describing how he had killed Anitra in what he claimed was a fit of rage after he told her he loved her and she laughed at him. Whether that detail was true or just another manipulation, another lie, didn't really matter. What mattered was that Demarcus had admitted to taking her life. For the jury, after days of testimony, evidence, and emotional witness statements, the picture was crystal clear. The violence, the cover-up, the devastating loss of a brilliant young woman whose entire future had been violently stolen from her. Imagine if it was your daughter, your sister, or your friend. Would you want their story buried under noise or told with care? Subscribing helps make sure nobody's story fades away. Not ready to subscribe? That's okay. But at least tell me why in the comments. I want to learn from you. After 7 full days of testimony and approximately 3 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. In March 2022, Demarcus Little was found guilty of felony murder and aggravated assault in the death of Anitra Gunn. He was acquitted of the malice murder charge, but convicted on the counts that carried the heaviest possible consequences. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the harshest sentence available under Georgia law, and for Anitra's family, it represented a measure of justice, though everyone in that courtroom knew that no sentence, no matter how severe, could ever bring Anitra back. No verdict could undo the pain. No punishment could fill the void she left behind. In that somber courtroom, Christopher Gunn listened as the verdict was read aloud. He had waited more than 2 years to hear those words. Guilty. It marked the end of one excruciatingly painful chapter, but it was also the beginning of another. A life forever changed, a future without his daughter, holidays without her laughter, milestones she would never reach. For the Fort Valley community, the verdict brought some relief, some sense that justice had been served, but it also brought lingering grief that would never fully fade. Anitra had been just months away from graduating college, from walking across that stage and receiving her diploma, from starting the next chapter of her life. She had overcome so much loss, so much pain, and she had been standing right on the edge of everything she had worked so hard for. The jury's decision ensured accountability and sent a message that Anitra's life mattered. But her absence left a void in Fort Valley State's campus, in her father's home, and in the hearts of everyone who knew her that no verdict could ever fill. Anitra Gunn was only 23 years old when her life was brutally stolen from her. She had already endured devastating loss when her mother died suddenly in that car accident, but she had absolutely refused to let tragedy define her future. She poured her heart and soul into her studies, her music, her friendships, and the tight-knit community she found at Fort Valley State University. She was a devoted daughter who made her father incredibly proud every single day. She was a loyal friend who lifted up everyone around her with her smile and her spirit. And she was a young woman with big dreams who deserved the chance to see every single one of them come true. You watched this whole video, felt the pain, and maybe even cried. But if you don't subscribe, this story risks dying in the shadows. Let's keep it alive. Subscribe. In the end, the courtroom delivered legal accountability. Demarcus Little will spend every remaining day of his life behind bars for what he did to Anitra. But justice in the purely legal sense can never truly undo the harm that was done. It cannot bring back the phone calls that went unanswered on that Valentine's Day. It cannot return the daughter Christopher Gunn cherished more than anything in this world. It cannot fill the empty chair at family gatherings or restore the voice missing from the Fort Valley State Choir. What justice can do, what we can do, is remember. We can remind ourselves and everyone listening that Anitra mattered. Her life mattered. Her dreams mattered. Her future mattered. And her story should never be reduced to just another headline, just another case number, just another tragic statistic. When we speak Anitra's name, when we tell her story, when we refuse to let her be forgotten, we honor not just the tragedy of how her life ended, but the absolute beauty of how she lived. A life overflowing with promise, with love, with creativity, with resilience, and with possibilities that should have stretched out before her for decades to come. As we remember Anitra Gunn today, let us hold tight to her light, her spirit, her beautiful smile, and let that light shine brighter, stronger, more powerfully than the darkness that tried so desperately to silence her voice forever. May Anitra Gunn rest in eternal peace. Her memory will live on in everyone whose life she touched, and her story will continue to be told. If this case touched you, if Anitra's story moved you, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, share this video so more people can learn about her life and her legacy, and drop a comment below telling me your thoughts. Subscribe to Cold Crime Cases if you haven't already, because we're dedicated to telling these important stories and giving victims like Anitra the voice they deserve. Thank you for watching. And until next time, stay safe out there.